Welcome to the fourth lecture in communication skills. This time around we're going to learn about the elements of communication. I expect all of you as students to be very much attentive as the lecture will be going on. Right, so now you need to understand that communication is actually a structured process made up of several interrelated components that work together to create meaning. So now these components commonly referred to as elements of communication. They are of great significance. Why? Because they determine whether communication is effective or ineffective. So now understanding these elements is actually very important for developing strong communication skills. Why? Because it enables individuals to identify where communication may break down and how it can be improved. So now in this lecture we are going to examine the major elements of communication and explains their roles in the communication process. Right, so now let's start with the first element of communication, which is actually the sender. The sender, which is also called the source or the encoder. So now, who is a sender? A sender, or the sender, who is also known as the source or encoder, is the person or entity that initiates the communication process. Now, the sender begins communication by doing what? By forming an idea, thought, or feeling, and then encoding it into a message that can be understood by the receiver. So now you need to understand that encoding actually involves selecting appropriate words, selecting symbols, or selecting appropriate gestures so as to convey the meaning. So now the effectiveness of communication largely depends on the sender's clarity of thoughts, language, and competency. Okay, now, and that possibly even awareness of the receiver's background and context. So meaning that for the communication to be more effective, largely that depends on the sender's clarity of thought. The sender must clarify the thoughts, or maybe the thoughts of the sender must be clear enough to be understood by the receiver. Then there must be also language competence. Okay, language competence. And then the sender also must be aware of the receiver's background and context. Right, and another thing that we need to know is that a sender who lacks clarity or uses inappropriate language may cause misunderstanding even if the message is transmitted correctly. For this reason, effective communicators must carefully plan and structure their message. Now, another important element that we need to discuss is the message. Okay, so now what's the message? Message is simply the information, idea, feeling, or thought that the sender wishes to communicate to the receiver. So now this message, it may be verbal, written, non-verbal, or visual in nature. So now messages can actually take the form of spoken words, written text, images, gestures, or symbols. Right, now according to DeVito 2019, messages are not limited to spoken language. They also include non-verbal cues such as a tone of voice, facial expressions, and body language, which actually often carry significant meaning. So now a message must be clear, concise, and relevant in order to achieve effective communication. Okay, so now ambiguous or poorly structured message increases the likelihood of misinterpretation. This is very important for you to know. Another important element is channel, which is also called medium. Right, so now talking about the channel or the medium, what is the channel? Channel which is also called the medium, is the means through which the message is transmitted from the sender to the receiver. So now channels may include face-to-face conversation, telephone calls, written letters, emails, social media platforms, or mass media such as radio and television. So now the choice of channel influences how the message is received and interpreted as well. So for example, face-to-face communication allows for immediate feedback and non-verbal cues. So while written communication provides a permanent record. So now selecting an appropriate channel depends on factors such as the nature of the message, agents, audience, and context. Right, so now let's move on to another important element, which is the receiver. The receiver, who is also called the decoder. Right, so now talking about the receiver or decoder. The receiver is the person or group for whom the message is intended. So now the receiver plays an active role in the communication process by decoding or interpreting the message. So now we are going to realize that decoding involves making sense of the message based on language ability, cultural background, experiences, and personal attitudes. So now we also need to understand that communication is always successful only when the receiver understands the message as it was intended by the sender. So if the receiver has not understood the message as it was intended by the sender, then the communication hasn't taken place, or maybe we would say the communication hasn't been successful. So now there are some differences possibly in perception. So differences in perception, language proficiency, or cultural background between the sender and receiver may lead actually to misunderstanding even when the message itself was clear. Another important element is feedback. So now what is feedback? Okay, feedback is the response that the receiver gives to the sender, that is after receiving and interpreting the message. So now it may be verbal or non-verbal, and this can also include questions, comments, facial expressions, or actions. So now feedback is very important. It's actually a critical element of communication. Why? Because it indicates whether the message has been understood correctly or not. Then according to Adriato 2017, feedback actually transforms communication from a one-way transmission into a two-way interactive process. So now through feedback, the sender can clarify or modify the message if necessary, thereby doing what? By improving communication effectiveness. Another element that we cannot ignore is the noise. Noise is also an element of communication. So now, how can we define noise? Noise in this case is defined as any factor that interferes with the transmission or understanding of a message. So now noise may be physical, such as loud sounds or poor network connections, psychological, such as stress, bias or lack of attention, or rather semantics, such as unfamiliar words or technical jargon. Now, noise can occur at any stage of the communication process, and often this can lead to misunderstanding or distortion of the meaning. Now, recognizing and minimizing noise is very important for effective communication. Let's move on to another important element, which is called the context. Now, talking about the context, let's try to define what it is. So now, what is the context? Context refers to the environment or situation in which communication takes place. So this includes physical, social, cultural, and psychological factors that influence how the messages are sent and interpreted. For example, communication in a classroom differs from communication in a social gathering or workplace. So now cultural context in particular plays a very important or significant role in shaping communication norms, language use, and non-verbal behavior. So now understanding context is of great significance. Why? Because it enables communicators to adjust their message appropriately to suit different situations and audiences. So now, in conclusion, communication actually consists of several interconnected elements, and this includes the sender, message, channel, receiver, feedback, noise, and context. And each element here plays a vital role in determining the success or failure of communication. So now you understand that a breakdown in any one element, of all these elements that we have discussed in this lecture, can result in misunderstanding. So now, by understanding these elements, therefore, you as students can actually develop effective communication skills and improve your ability to communicate clearly and confidently in academic, professional, and social settings. Right, so now you find that this table actually now makes the summary. The table that we have here makes a summary of whatever I have explained. So we have the sender here, and then we have the receiver. Okay, you can see the arrow, it shows the direction of the communication. So the message is being sent or maybe encoded by the sender, then it goes to the receiver, and then what we have here is the message, but the message has to reach the receiver through the channel. Okay, then the receiver, who is also called the decoder, decodes the message, or the message. But then in the process, there is a likelihood of noise taking place. So now, this noise may cause some kind of interruption, which may cause the receiver sometimes not to understand the sender clearly. By the end of the day, when the message reaches the receiver must understand the message, and after understanding the message, the receiver should send or maybe should answer or give response to the sender. Now that response that the receiver gives to the sender is what is referred to as what? The feedback. So now the moment the receiver understands the message from the sender and then gives the feedback, then we say that communication has taken place. So the elements of communication, we have got the context, we've got the sender, we've got encoding, we've got the message, the channel, decoding, receiver, feedback, and noise, right? And this is where we end for today. Thank you so much.